Welcome to the In My Opinion show. I am Henry Hatter, your host today. We will be discussing the life and legend of Cesar Chavez. I have two Hispanic gentlemen here who are well versed in the life and legend of Chavez. So, one is Sixto Olivo.
Yes.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And Robert Garza, who has been a long time guest on the show. Why should we celebrate the life of Cesar Chavez?
Well, Cesar Chavez was an outstanding leader for the Latinos, especially for the migrant and immigrant workers in the Southwest United States. And one reason basically that we should remember him is that he improved the lives of farm workers all over. So that included human rights, housing, fair wages, the formation of the United Farm Workers Union, and just in general, a better life for people who had suffered.
All Americans. Irrespective of their race and gender.
Who had suffered hardships when they labored in the fields. So for that alone, all of us, all people of color, should remember him and really acknowledge his efforts that he accomplished.
Sixto, I assume that you were very versed on who Chavez was.
Yes, he was I knew him personally. I had the pleasure of hosting him when he came into Flint in, I believe it was 89. It was about 1989, and he stayed at my house for 3 days, and he was visiting the local colleges, speaking to the problems in the pesticides in the area of pesticides and the grapes at that time. The grape boycotts were going on, and of course his continuing attention being brought to the marginalization of the farm workers specifically, but he also addressed the marginalization of people that were not empowered, generally speaking, by virtue of money and connections. So he was more than just a champion of farm workers, and he shared that with us when he used to sit there with us in the mornings and speak of his personal ambitions and his thoughts. It was really quite an exciting,
I'm going to come back to that
time.
Roberto, how has the people in the city of Flint chose to remember Chavez?
Well,
Give some specifics.
Yeah, one thing.
You were here at the college and universities.
One thing people do in the area is to celebrate his birthday, which is March 31st. And they do that by, for example, like we're having a Cesar Chavez celebration March 31st at Mott College. So what that does is acknowledge his legacy. It reminds people of the accomplishments that he did for all people of color. And what else we're going to do is to acknowledge community members that mirror the character of Cesar Chavez today.
Well, great. And compare and contrast the difficulty or ease that Cesar Chavez created the FSA, the Farm Service Bureau, or
United Farm
Bureau, or
Farm Workers Union.
Yeah. Okay. Please explain what that is, and then tell us how he specifically created that when there was so much difficulty to do that. He had no links to the people in power, the owners, the operators, and he didn't have an established network of individuals that he could call upon to carry orders out. How did he do that?
Well, he knew the power in organizing people, bringing people together for a cause, la causa. So he was very successful with that. He organized meetings throughout California, Arizona. He was in Colorado, Texas, and bringing the people in and letting them know that if they could organize collectively, they could create a union, they could create bargaining, and as a result of that, improvements could be held by everyone involved.
Sixto, have we created anything of a lasting memory for Chavez, who was here?
Yes. Coincidentally, the brochure that I had brought in to you alludes to that. It says in 1986, Chavez was on the site to witness a historic event to name the Cesar Chavez Drive the first ever in the state or in the nation, according to the brochure. And this was done through the joint efforts of Woodrow Stanley and Paul Vasquez. They collaborated and worked together to get both Cesar Chavez Drive and Martin Luther King Avenue. So this was an example of people that have a common collective ambition and wish to make things better for those that are underserved. Make it happen.
Would people know exactly where Chavez Drive is?
Well, it's been changed for quite a few years, so I think those living in the area know about that drive.
It's a service drive along
Yes, along
If you go toward the college, you will see Chavez.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that honors Cesar Chavez is the national monument that is outside of Bakersfield, California. So there's a national monument there to honor him, and President Obama was there the opening day acknowledging that.
Okay. What was the major issues that Chavez was advocating for?
Well,
be specific. Tell us what they were.
Well, generally speaking, you can begin with what the major problems were. If you identify what the problems were, then you can pretty much identify what his efforts were. And that is, as I said before, not only the marginalization of the people that were working in the fields. If you look at that historically, Henry, we were statistically significant in the field, so the politicians weren't interested in making changes. There were no labor laws covering for instance, if somebody got hurt in the fields, the compensation laws didn't cover them at that time. The children of the migrant workers weren't forced to go to school. The school systems that guaranteed that the mainstream young people went to school. The young people working in the fields were needed in the fields, so it was need-based rather than what was right. And so education for the migrant workers suffered as a result of that. These were the things that Cesar Chavez worked to change. He worked for improving the working conditions because there were no sanitary conditions. There were no sanitary provisions in the fields. The people were overworked and underpaid. They were abused, as many people were that didn't have the power to change things. And because they were kept sort of under bondage, if you will, by virtue of the farmers together colluding to keep the wages down so that the workers had to work as much as possible without having time to do anything else, including education. And that's what he worked to change. I
was surprised when Roberto said that they didn't have sanitary facilities in the field. And then you had these women, some of whom were pregnant, and they had to take care of the babies, and they have their own
issues,
they have their own issues that they need to take care of in a private setting. I was surprised that that occurred, and that they had those kind of But can you tell me how the movement for the Hispanics was similar to the movement for the UAW back in the 30s?
Well,
wages, was it? Safety?
Yes. I'm going to say, of course, Henry, everything that was relevant to the labor movement in general, and that is improving the working conditions for the average working man that didn't have the power the money, the ability to change things, because power, quite frankly, comes from the top.
Yeah.
And to come from the bottom has to come from numbers, almost collectively. That's why we have unions. It's because you have to have a collective effort when you don't have power from the top. It must, coming from the bottom, it has to be a collective effort of people.
And I would say for the Hispanics, this was, if you think about it, kind of an inordinate thing hill to climb, because there were people, they could be assassinated if you're a leader, just like that happened with the UAW or Martin Luther King's group or whatever. And I was really amazed by Chavez's striving to do that in spite of the fact that he could have been killed, a loss of personal reputation, and loss of opportunities.
Well, see, Henry, in addition to that, when he stayed with us, and there were several other of us in the community that shared conversations with him, he shared that thought that he had to leave his family behind. So there were sacrifices made in order to help the greater number of people. But women have always been the big part of labor movements that go unrecognized. The wives of the labor leaders that have to stay home and take care of the children and the obligations that lay at home. And I wish that we could celebrate them as much as we do the leaders that come out and seem to be in the forefront of the change. It's true here with Henry Acevedo and with Paul Vasquez and with all people that go out and serve the greater community. The ladies at home also sit and serve.
I see you're talking about the ladies a lot. Let me ask you, there's a lot going on with women around the world right now, being
the Me Too movement.
Yeah, the Me Too group, and what women issues are, being embarrassed and being habitually handled roughly and stuff like that. Did this happen with Hispanic women when they were in the field? Were they raped, or was that something? Or did you have young men who took advantage of them?
Absolutely,
stuff like that.
Yeah.
Explain how we connect those two problems together, if they are connectable.
Yeah. Well, the women have always suffered abuses. The immigrant women and the migrant women that were working in the fields. So you have to remember that not only men worked in the fields, but women and children too worked in the fields. So there was abuse of all sorts. With the children, there was just child abuse. With the women, there was abuse from perhaps other men, perhaps their farm owners. And how does a person in that status, in that environment, seek help, legal help? Pretty much impossible. So those abuses have been with the immigrant and migrant women for a long time. And there's a young lawyer in Washington whose name is Monica Ramirez, who addresses those issues. So again, her name is Monica Ramirez, works out of Washington. She also works for LACLA, which is the Latin Council for Latin American Advancement. You can find her under that particular title. So she advocates for the rights of women today and yesterday too.
Who was Senora Huerta?
Dolores Huerta was and is another labor leader. Okay, she worked right alongside with Cesar Chavez to organize the United Farm Workers Union. She did a lot of the same work that Chavez did, marched, organized, and she was also brutalized by the police in California at one time. Put her in the hospital, and she had a long recovery out of that because they were advocating for all these rights under the bargaining segment of the unions, and there was people against them, whether it was the farm owners, the police, or others that were brought in.
Well,
And she lives today, In fact, we're going to give you a link to a video that I put together just recently. I went to Michigan State University a few weeks ago, and she was there proclaiming the same message as Cesar Chavez.
I think, are we supposed to have a link here? Or was that for the next show?
They're going to provide it on this video here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but if in some case you don't see that link, visit RobertoGarza.com and click on Michigan Latino Central, and you'll find that video.
Report that again to our audience.
Okay.
So they can.
So go to RobertoGarza.com, click on Michigan Latino Central, and look for the video Dolores Huerta Chavez.
Okay. How have we come to memorialize Miss Huerta?
Ms. Huerta?
Yeah.
Would you like to say a little more on that?
Because I think she deserves to be mentioned.
Well, certainly, yeah, but you see, many of the celebrations that include, or rather that are commemorating Cesar include this. Now, the fact that we talk about it here minimally doesn't mean that when we talk about Cesar generally out there in presentations of his memory and commemorating him, because he died, and because he was so instrumental in the beginning, but Dolores Huerta is also included in many of them. As a matter of fact, she holds many conferences throughout the United States and colleges and places like that. She was in Lansing recently, wasn't she, Robert?
She was.
Yeah.
She wasn't just simply a public relations person, but she actually got
she was a
she got her hands dirty.
Yeah.
She got her face bloody or whatever.
Yeah.
She was really involved in it.
Yeah. And still does a lot of that same work today. Her message was the same back then, and it's the same today, that although it appears that at some points that the United Farm Workers Union has progressed, sometimes it doesn't seem that way. So, we'll talk more about that. Right?
How will you celebrate coming up in 6 days, the birthday of Chavez?
It's March 31st.
March 31st. What kind of activities will you have going? Will you have those activities going on nationally and in Flint as well?
Well, they're celebrated locally and generally in the at a state level and at the national level. So there are multiple celebrations throughout the nation, celebrating and commemorating Cesar Chavez. We decided to do it here at the Hispanic Tech Center with a cooperation and collaboration with Mott Community College. They've always been extremely supportive. And this is not the first celebration that we've had. It's sort of a continuation of what we've been doing for years in celebrating and commemorating both his memory and his contributions to what it has meant to the Mexican-American workers and all the other, quite frankly, anybody that's been a migrant farm worker. And at great expense to him personally. You asked a question about, or mentioned the fact that they were in danger from time to time. Cesar, when he was here, told me about the time that he was in California and he was speaking there, and he had, similar to what Martin Luther King had, he had the FBI tracking him. Now, for whatever the reasons were at the time, but they also apprised him of the fact that there was a threat on his life at that time. The FBI notified him of that. So he had to leave at that particular time. He said, jumped in his pickup truck and took off, and he had his dog with him. He called it Boycott. And he says, the dog jumped out of the truck and ran into the desert. This story gets a little bit mystical. But Cesar told me that later he went home and he thought about his dog and his vision where his dog was. And he went out into the desert and he found his dog. And he picked him up and took him back home. This was the mystical part of Cesar Chavez. But he left there because the FBI was monitoring.
The dog survived.
The dog survived and Cesar went on, yes. But the interesting part is that the FBI was, in fact, both tracking and watching out for them too.
Good. Well, in my research, I understand that was it San Francisco was a real close friend of the Mexicans, of the Hispanics, for a long time. As a matter of fact, they recognized the Mexicans for their efforts back in 1869, I think, or maybe that was associated with the war against the French in those days. But there are states in the United States that need the service of the Hispanic Americans for the farms and stuff like that. Large states like California and Montana and Michigan and many of the Ohio states and down by Ohio, they have a great need for Hispanic American workers. And does Michigan, when you compare Michigan to other states, does Michigan give more support to Hispanic Americans than others?
Well, I don't know that there's a way to measure that. That is, generally speaking, the improvements have been ongoing, and of course out in California, because as they say, the squeaking wheel gets the grease, and out in California there have been some major changes, and of course they flow into the changes of the farm workers here in the local areas. We were talking earlier about the facilities for in the fields, sanitary facilities, and now they do have those laws that are governing and inspections of the migrant workers. So there have been some, Henry, specifically I couldn't point to each one of them, but yes, there have been some major improvements in the area of taking care of the needs and the sanitary conditions of the farm workers.
How should young Hispanics be engaged in improving the lot of the Hispanic American and the farm working?
Well, generally you can say that about anybody that wants to affect change must get involved. We've talked about Santino at age 19. He's a young Hispanic, but he decided to get involved politically and he got elected. I think that we have some young people both in the area and in the state, and generally there's quite a bit of interest, and because of the DACA problem, that young Hispanics feeling marginalized are reacting to this marginalization, and they're saying no more, no más. And they're getting involved, and they're going to affect change. And yes, you can affect change by getting involved and speaking out, which is pretty much what Cesar Chavez said right along. And education, Cesar Chavez spoke to that. We all recognize that is key to moving ahead. Get educated, get involved, and affect change.
I read in my research that that Hispanics learn to compete with the man who has the money, the owners and operators, and I think it was in California, maybe Colorado. But they were competing with the masters, and they were doing a good job. You might have more to say about that. Are you aware of that?
Competing in the sense of?
They bought farms and began to compete in the farming business. Mm-hmm. They sold their products the same as the traditional owner and operator.
When you look back at Cesar Chavez, his family had a big farm in Arizona. But because of the war and the Great Depression that was going on at that time, that they were forced out of the farm. But people back then had a lot of Latinos, Hispanics had large farms. So like others in the United States, big agribusiness bought them out, or they were forced out. Many of them were not able to pay, the mortgage on the farm because of the depression, because of the war. So they got out as the same way that happened with other Americans. But they are in general, Latinos are geared for, and are not ashamed of working, producing labor to make gains, in their personal lives and their economic life. They do labor.
Yes, and I can only imagine what our country would be like if we didn't have the Hispanics working for. And it shows a lot about. I was on the Michigan State Board of Public Policy Research, and in 1990, it said, and they were comparing groups by color and and their job responsibilities. And it said that back then that they gave the average wage per individual or per family. And it was back then that the wages were about $17,000 for a black family. That was the average wage throughout Michigan. And then for the Hispanic, it was $23,000. And we did some research on why there was that disparity, because you would have never guessed it. But they were making up that money through the farming industry. You might have known that, right? Yeah. So that says a lot about what Hispanics and Latinos and contribute to the.
And today, the new message or recent message is that what they're saying is that we feed you, we feed America.
Yeah.
So people have to remember that they go out, work the jobs that most Americans won't work for extreme low wages, under bad working conditions, and they do literally feed America from the crops that they pick.
Well, any last words here?
Just one other thing. You asked a question about the current times where Latinos are now competing for the land and buying some of the land. Originally, the lands were owned by the Latinos. When these countries were annexed, the land grants were not recognized by the judges. Therefore, those land changed over to the.
I'm glad you pointed that out because I had forgotten that.
Extremely important,
But this transition from moving from poor up is a good trend, and there are more Hispanics being involved and Latinos being involved in the agribusiness. And the agribusiness will do nothing but grow as we lose our industries, and we've lost a lot of them. Some of them are coming back now. We will focus a lot more on the farming products that we produce in this country to keep it vibrant and alive. And the money that the owners and operators had back in the old days, they plowed that back into their profits and both their personal profits and investments. And that was money that could have been had by Hispanics, but they did some good things too, because they did improve the equipment and stuff like that they did. I don't know how much of that went back to improve the quality of life for Hispanics, but I think things are going to change for the best for Hispanics in this country. They're becoming more of the elected officials.
Yeah, we hope so.
All of that.
Also, another thing that we didn't touch on, maybe we'll hit on it next time, is pesticides.
Yes, we want to get to drugs. Okay, guys, the show has to come to a close now, and I appreciate you being on the show. You did a great job. You informed us a lot, and now it's time to say goodbye.
Thank you.
This is the In My Opinion show, saying till next time.
Thank you.